Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. I was so glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. And I was really glad when the word was that I was to go to the Plymouth United Church of Christ. I truly and sincerely admire your commitment as a church. And I have read your church statement. Bear with me because you've read it many times, but I'm not familiar with it, and it just is so striking to me. And it's a source of great spiritual guidance for me. No matter who you are, where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here to discover meaning in life, to grow in a relationship with God, and to serve neighbors near and far. Thank you, Plymouth Church, for serving your neighbors with love, compassion, and respect, regardless of their race, creed, color, gender, sex, sexual orientation, or beliefs. I would be remiss if I did not take one moment of personal privilege to do a shout out to a man of character, conviction, integrity, and genuine love for God and all of God's people. I am, of course, speaking of a committed pastor, a devoted husband, a loving father, a tireless advocate for justice, a true personal friend of mine, your senior pastor, Pastor Andrew Warner. Okay, so now Pastor Warner knows that I'm feeling a little nervous about being here behind this pulpit. My ministry that I claim is that of providing food, clothing, and shelter, educational opportunities for people, and not necessarily shepherding them through their spiritual guidance. So I was a little bit intimidated when I realized that I was going to deliver not just a message, but the sermon. It was like, seriously? And then I saw in the program that I was delivering the sermon. So I Googled the top 3 definitions of sermon, and I was fascinated by the third definition. Sermon, a long, tedious speech. So I'll try not to be too long or too tedious. But I do need to do this. Before we get started, can we just all bow our heads just for a moment and for a word of prayer? Dear God, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with these, your people at the Plymouth Church. You've already spoken to me, and I am asking sincerely, Lord, that you speak through me, and that there be a word from you for the people. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge the people who sort of came in with me, that dragged in with me. This is really scary. Like my whole office has come. You guys got paid already, didn't you? Ron Stinson, who is my executive assistant, is here with me today. And Sheila Payton is here, who is volunteering. All of them are volunteering on their own time. No tax dollars being spent to accompany me here today. Ms. Hope DeVogus, you're going to hear from her soon. She's a member of my congressional staff, and she's going to regale us with some civil rights songs and lead us in them. And of course, my district director is here, Ms. Shirley Ellis. You all know your member, Chetchuan, who was here. The Democratic Party is here today. And my baby sister, Brenda Moore, who's my political director. I want to thank all of them for coming here to support me in this unusual appearance for me. You know, in keeping with our theme today, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, I want to reference a very familiar story a biblical account of David, the shepherd boy, versus the giant Goliath. You are all very, very familiar with this horrific mismatch that's found in First Samuel, and I trust that you will all rush home right afterwards and read the entire chapter, of the 17th chapter, which will give you the details of how horrible this mismatch was. You should look at the 17th chapter. It just describes in great detail all of the armor that Goliath had on, and so on, and David being the one who would step up to fight the giant. So I was inspired by this story, and I'm titling this sermon, "It's Time for a Showdown." So turn to your neighbor and repeat after me, "It's time for a showdown." Come on. It's time for a showdown. On Tuesday, the 28th of July, 2015, President Barack Obama had just come to talk to 9 members of his congressional delegation to Africa, and to encourage all of us to sleep on this first leg back to the United States. And that wasn't very hard because I was pretty exhausted. And I buckled in and I looked out one of the windows of Air Force One, and I thought about just the tremendous message that the president had delivered to a country. And it seemed to me that they were like 50 years behind us in some civil rights efforts. And I was one of 20 members of Congress who had been invited to travel with the president on his trip to Kenya, to Ethiopia. We did not find his birth certificate, by the way. But, you know, as the jet lag set in, and I was feeling very exhausted, sleep getting the better of me, I slept, and my mind sort of drifted back to 1967, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and I was there at the very tender age of 15. And it was a night when I knew that I could no longer stand on the periphery. I could no longer be a spectator to the injustice that I saw. It was a night when I had become a foot soldier in the movement. You know, Milwaukee attained the nickname Selma of the North by virtue of how segregated our city was and still is. And we could not venture African Americans beyond a small 2 or 3 mile radius that was designated as the inner core, the inner city. And with Vel Phillips, then an alderman, Father Groppe, members of the NAACP, Prentice McKinney, hundreds of other protesters, I grabbed my baby sister Brenda's hand and ventured across the infamous 16th Street Bridge. I think they've renamed it the Groppe Bridge now, marching from the north side of Milwaukee that night in 1957. It wasn't for voting rights, but it was for open housing, for fair housing, to pass a fair housing ordinance. I remembered being hit in the head with a no deposit bottle as I walked across that bridge. But I knew, as we were singing, ain't nobody, we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around, turn us around, turn us around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. We just gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom way. And I can say that I have not turned back from my passion for that. And I thought about the folks in Africa, and I thought about the president delivering the word to them and delivering a message of transformation, the kinds of things that would transform Africa. He had talked about economic development and entrepreneurial opportunities all through our trip. But when he spoke directly to them, he was talking about the stuff that really was going to transform Africa, and that was transformation of the culture into one that respected the rights of everyone, respected the rights of all the people in Africa. And so it was very much on my mind. And while I lay back in my seat, I thought about the journey that I just took just recently back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. 50 years later, standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, a bridge where hundreds of peaceful protesters from all over the country were attacked with billy clubs and fists and tear gas because they had the integrity and the courage to protest not for voting privileges, but for voting rights for everyone. That Sunday has been recorded in history as Bloody Sunday. And as I stood there just this March with my fellow members of the Congressional Black Caucus, civil rights leaders from all over the country, foot soldiers now elderly, infirm, in wheelchairs, friends of the movement, friends of every color and creed. We even wore lei that had been sent from Hawaii to celebrate the occasion. As we stood in remembrance of the struggles, it was hard not to grieve and feel some despair about the legions of legislation and efforts that have threatened to roll us back and put us back on that bridge, to put us back under the billy clubs. As we stood there with friends, I got a great big hug from Nancy Wallace, daughter of George Wallace. A hug of reconciliation and love. It was still hard to believe that after 50 years, we were right back where we were. As the first black president of the United States of America stood in Selma, Alabama, with the Edmund Pettus Bridge looming in the background, he spoke eloquently and forcefully and said, quote, "Right now in 2015, 50 years after Selma, there are laws across this country designed to make it harder for people to vote. As we speak, more of such laws are being proposed. Meanwhile, the Voting Rights Act, the culmination of so much blood, so much sweat and tears, the product of so much sacrifice in the face of wanton violence, the Voting Rights Act stands weakened, its future subject to political rancor." I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and I am sorry to say that in 2011, Wisconsin joined the map of shame as we passed one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country. And in the years since, we have fought valiantly, having some of the major NGOs like the NAACP and LULAC and the ACLU fight and go to state Supreme Court and to the United States Supreme Court to try to fight back these laws. It is so reminiscent of the stories I have heard from John Lewis when he talks about how black people in the South, not in Milwaukee, who were desperately trying to register to vote, had to appear before racist election officials and guess the number of bubbles on a bar of soap, or guess the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to be able to register to vote. And I can tell you that some of the legal battles that we have fought right here in Wisconsin seem as capricious and nefarious as counting the bars on the jelly bean. 300,000 Wisconsinites lack the proper form of strict ID that is now needed under Wisconsin law. And honestly, even though we have fought these fights valiantly, in 2016, every Wisconsinite will be subject to voter ID laws, although it's very, very clear that the people who lack this kind of ID are students, very elderly people, African Americans, and Latinos. And these voter ID laws will have a chilling impact on the magnificent job Wisconsin has done with our same-day registration laws. It will nullify it to a large degree. We remember those brave souls who marched across the Edmonds-Pettus Bridge. As women, we remember the brave suffragettes who sought equal treatment for over 70 years. We remember those brave folk who fought and even died for the right to vote. When I was in Selma, I had an opportunity to meet so many foot soldiers whose brothers have died registering people to vote, whose fathers, who had been part of the Ku Klux Klan and belonged to the same chapter where the 3 little girls were murdered, those people converged on Selma. And that gave me hope to see people who had been enemies of the struggle come together in a new generation and join the fight. And that is what we have got to do. We have got to take history and our Constitution and weaponize it, because the fight is not over, no matter what the Supreme Court has said. History has made it very clear that voting is not a privilege, it is a right. And the right to vote has been affirmed more than any other constitutional right. We often hear about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, ad nauseum. But that's only protected by one constitutional amendment. We hear ad nauseum at the right for free speech, which is covered by the First Amendment. But the right to vote was affirmed in the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, the 15th Amendment, which gave former male slaves, and adult males of any race the right to vote. Finally, in the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage vote was won. The 24th Amendment, which eliminated, supposedly, poll taxes that you'd have to pay to vote. And the 26th Amendment, which enabled those 18 years old to vote. And of course, the now eviscerated Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we know what the motivation is of these folk in Wisconsin who want to disenfranchise those 300,000 people who have no voter IDs. The court found that blacks were 1.4 times as likely to not have this kind of ID. Latinos, 2.3 times as likely not to have the ID. And it is not a joke. They actually say that voter fraud and voter impersonation is a problem. And a renowned Judge Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, a Reagan appointee, who voted for the for photo ID in Indiana, seems to have had some regrets about that. And he summed up the absurdity of the Republican state legislature's logic and said, quote, "As there is no evidence that voter impersonation fraud is a problem, how can the fact that a legislature say it's a problem turn into one?" And he goes on to say, "There is only one motivation for imposing burdens on voting that are ostensibly designed to discourage voter impersonation laws. If there is no actual danger of such fraud, and that is to discourage voting by persons likely to vote against the party responsible for imposing the burdens." Well, we've all heard the old adage that history repeats itself. So we have seen across the country Republican legislatures and governors passing these voter ID laws, the Jim Crow laws that have blocked our ancestors from the polls. So, these people cannot be ignored, you all. It's time for a showdown. They've got to be confronted. These are the giants. The giant that is facing us as an American people. And it is so easy to cower and say, what can we do about it? It's so easy to feel discouraged and say, well, you know what? What's wrong with people being required to have a photo ID? Why can't they just give up 3 or 4 hours at the DMV and get one? They got to work during the week? Maybe they should go up to Madison, the only place in the state where the DMV will be open on Saturday, and get one. I mean, if they want to be a good citizen, maybe we ought to just allow this. Well, I can tell you, it is an injustice to disenfranchise 300,000 people in Wisconsin. And as Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We got to stand up to these giants, y'all. Voter suppression, voter oppression, voter intimidation. Have you seen voter intimidation? Voter intimidation, you go to a polling site in the inner city of Milwaukee, and there will be people who will be standing in people's faces as they try to vote. Voter incrimination. The League of Women Voters, for example, talked about laws in places like Florida where they say if you don't turn the voter registration card in within, like a 24-hour time period, then a group could be indicted. You see what they did to destroy ACORN, organizations that 501c3 organizations that try to register people to vote. So there's a lot of intimidation about folk like you who might try to register people to vote. And then voter discrimination. You walk in and someone doesn't speak good English, and they get challenged at the polls. We cannot be bullied by this white right-wing rhetoric and these ill-advised legislatures. We must confront them and let them know. What we got to let them know? Come on, y'all. What we got to let them know? It's time for a showdown, y'all. I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version about the big, bad giant Goliath. He was 9 foot tall with a 125-pound brass plate. And it was David, of course. He wasn't a professional fighter. He wasn't a well-paid assassin. He was not a marksman. No, he was somebody that his mother had sent him into the field to give his brothers some meat and some bread. Go on out there and give your big brothers on this front line something to eat. He was just a shepherd boy. And Goliath had just said, come on, bring one of your big bad men here to fight me. And David stepped up to the plate. David, that mere shepherd boy, represents us, the people. The people who love God and love justice. People who hate evil and injustice. We have to take on inequality, racism, sexism, and discrimination wherever it could be identified. And David didn't want all of that armor, all of that heavy stuff, AK-47s. I mean, we're not going to hit the streets and start rioting about these laws. He didn't have any drones or chemical weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. David was armed with the power of God, with the strength of the people, the conviction of his commitment to his call. What did he have? He had a slingshot, y'all, and 5 smooth stones. That's all he had. And just as we're commemorating 50 years, 5 decades of the Voting Rights Act being signed, each one of these 5 smooth stones that I'm holding here represents a decade. You know, the number 5 biblically stands for grace. And God's grace is what is going to help us win this race, because God's grace is amazing. One of the things that caught my attention as I read 1 Samuel chapter 17 was David's approach to the giant. David did not run from the giant. He ran to the giant. And we all know what Goliath's fate was when he met the shepherd boy. My friends, let's not run from these giants. Let's run to them. Let's reach into our bag full of grace, our 5 stones, and let's pull our stones out. Let's aim. Let's hit the giant. We got to hit the giant legislatively. We got to get passed in Congress the bill that Congressman Sensenbrenner has co-authored with Democrats to fix the Voting Rights Act. We need to encourage Congressman Sensenbrenner. He used to represent y'all. Now I got you. But for whatever you think of Sensenbrenner, Sensenbrenner is a key to our winning some legislative victories. So we need to contact him. We got to be strategic. We still got to continue those legal battles. Kudos to the NAACP and ACLU and LULAC and the League of Women Voters. Those people who continue to press on despite what has been said and say that the Constitution should prevail over everything else. That's one of our stones. We got to prevail morally. Churches like Plymouth UCC, organizations like Micah, Wisdom, our interfaith organizations have got to continue to be that moral message and moral fiber that carries us through. We got to support the right to vote financially. We may have to figure out how to raise money to get birth certificates for people so that they can get this proper ID. We may have to spend a little gas to drive people to the to the motor vehicle department. Come up with some time to sit with them. Maybe have food that we provide to do teach-ins and educational fora so that people will know how important it is to vote. And then, y'all, we got to load up our last stone. You know, it only took one stone to kill Goliath. We got to put it in our slingshot, y'all. And we got to run to the giant, not away from the giant. We got to aim right in the forehead of the giant. And that is, we got to fight it politically. What did Martin Luther King Jr. say? We got to march on these ballot boxes until we're able to elect men and women who will do justice. We got to march and carry people to these polls and show them that we are going to win. Like John Lewis said, we're going to put our bodies in the way. We got to get every 18-year-old with these photo IDs and make sure that they show up for the showdown. And our next showdown is 2016. And I want to make sure that Wisconsin is on the front lines of saying no more will we sit complacent and allow to be elected to power evil men or women who will not do justice and have mercy. Thank you so much for this invitation, and all of you be blessed.